Thank you for joining us for the very final session of the virtual face-to-face 2026 conference. Really, really glad to have you all here to put a button on our virtual conference this year. This final session is The Art of the Ask, Grant Writing Best Practices for Individuals. Before we get too much farther, I'll introduce myself if we haven't met. My name is Kinsey. I am a white woman with shoulder length or chin length brown hair and I'm wearing some large kind of round wire framed glasses that are a little bit purple on the edges. I'm also wearing a kind of chocolate brown ribbed sweater shirt with some cream colored buttons that go all the way down the front. I'm in front of a blurred background in my office, which you can see the walls are sort of a minty green color. And I am also the programs director here at the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable. Although we are all gathering right now via Zoom online, the Roundtable would like to acknowledge that we do work and live on unceded lands. Mannahatta, but the place that is widely known as New York City, does exist on the contemporary and ancestral homelands of the Canarsie, Munsee, Lenape, and Wappinger people. These sovereign nations and communities are still thriving here, and we continue to occupy their lands. We would like to give a moment of respect to them, as well as to the Black, Brown, and immigrant communities, which have helped build the city that we know and love today. As we recognize that all of our pasts, presents, and futures are intertwined, just once more, I'm going to uplift a handful of contemporary Indigenous arts organizations that we'd love to highlight. We feel we can all learn from and support. So please, if you haven't before, check out these organizations, support them with donations if you can. We also invite you at this time, if you have other organizations that you would like to uplift with folks on the chat in the call today, in the chat, please do so. At any time. Thank you. So I just want to take one more moment to acknowledge our incredible sponsors for the Face-to-Face 2026 conference, without whom we would not be able to do such robust programming for the conference. So super, super grateful to all of them who make up the sponsors for this year's conference. But in particular, the four that we see on the screen, their logos on the screen right now, have brought us this specific session today. So we're very grateful to them. They are Surface Impression, The Art of Education, NYU Steinhardt's Program in Educational Theater, and the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. So again, just a huge thank you to them and all of our sponsors. And you can learn more about all of our sponsors on the sponsor tab of our Face-to-Face 2026 website. Okay, now for just a few reminders. If you're having any trouble with Zoom while you're on the call with us today, please just send me a private message and I will do everything I can to help. Please remember to make sure that your mic is on mute. Check it now. That way we can hear anyone who is speaking clearly. We do encourage you to use the chat to connect with others on the call. You can introduce yourself now and where you're calling in from if you'd like. And we will also collect questions from the chat for some Q&A at the end of the session. This meeting does include live ASL interpretation. It also includes automated closed captioning via Zoom. So if you'd like to turn on captions, they're in your toolbar or in the More section of your toolbar. Then you'll find captions and you can click Show Captions to have them start populating for you. Please note that the Roundtable event policy is that we don't allow AI chatbots or transcription or recording devices into our Zoom spaces. So if you do have one that came in, we will be removing it. If you have an access need related to your bot or have any questions about it, please just send me a message and let me know. And I think the last item is that this session is being recorded. It will be made available to registrants with all the other recordings and resources from Face-to-Face at the conclusion of the conference. So look for that email from me. And I do believe that's enough. I'm very, very excited now to turn it over so that we can get our last session started. So everyone, please join me in welcoming the moderator for our panel today, Lucia Schechner from Brooklyn Arts Exchange. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Lucia Schechner, she, her pronouns. I'll offer a self-description. I'm a middle-aged white woman with dirty blonde, somewhat graying hair in a braid over my left shoulder, and I'm wearing a black short sleeve button-up top with white polka dots. I have grayish blue eyes. Well, I'm so delighted to be here, and I want to thank Kinsey and Face to Face for the invitation to be part of this meaningful conversation for our sector. Again, my name is Lucia Schechner, and I'm the co-executive director of education at the Brooklyn Arts Exchange, also known as BAX. And for anyone unfamiliar with BAX, we're a nonprofit multi-generational arts incubator located in South Brooklyn in Park Slope. And we do have a new annex space in downtown Brooklyn as well. BAX nurtures artistic practice centering community and advancing racial and cultural justice through education, residencies, and performance. And we're soon going to be celebrating in the upcoming season our 35th anniversary, which feels exciting to lift up in this moment as well. Um, Also, for the sake of this conversation, I wanted to share that I'm the co-editor in chief of the Teaching Artist Journal, which is a Taylor and Francis Routledge Press. It's a global platform dedicated to conversations at the intersection of practice, philosophy, and education for teaching artists worldwide. And I'm also a practicing freelance artist as a dramaturg for opera and theater. So I share that because I know that this conversation includes many individual artists and arts educators. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about where you all are coming from in your questions. It's my pleasure to welcome our panelists, Tracy O'Reilly from the Bronx Council of the Arts and Hannah Myers from Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. In just a moment, I'm going to turn it over to them along with the first question to get us started, and hopefully they'll introduce themselves a little bit more as well. And again, for the sake of the conversation, to start by acknowledging who might be in the room, this is a really interesting conversation to engage specifically individual artists. So that might include practicing artists as well as arts educators, teaching artists, and perhaps for many of you, those are roles that you live simultaneously. And so thinking about that at the forefront of this conversation, I imagine many folks on this call are curious about seeking funding opportunities, fellowships, career development opportunities, perhaps residencies, perhaps operating in a variety of ecosystems within that, interdisciplinary work, independent practices. So we're looking forward to connecting all of those dots. And I welcome at this point, if anyone does want to share in the chat your name and what hat, so to speak, you're wearing to this conversation. And if related, there's a burning question you want to forefront to please just put it in there. And thanks to Kinsey, we'll be keeping a log of that now as well as later so we can circle back and engage the audience in those questions. To frame the conversation, I've been thinking quite a bit about the dynamics and often the inherent power dynamics between funders and those seeking funding. And I want to offer, as we get started, to anchor in the value of relationship building, and that we have the opportunity in this discussion to sort of affect the change we want to see in the sector, that we are all people, that we are all operating within a shared ecosystem, and that especially at a moment with such increasing pressures, both financially as well as against civil liberties, the opportunity we have to engage these conversations as partners and as potential collaborators, and really valuing the lived expertise and experience of everyone in this room, so to speak. And also, of course, that context matters, that here we are having a conversation with two representatives from New York City arts councils. And so what is unique to where we all are geographically and what's happening within that context? I'm going to start us off with some bigger picture questions, just so we can think about the landscape that we're in, and then we're going to move into more specifics around resources and relationship building and grant writing tips. So to start us off, I wonder if I could pass it to the two of you, Tracy and Hannah, to let us know again where you're coming from, what your role is in the organization, and what are some key factors that you're noticing that are shaping the New York City funding landscape, and more particularly within your councils, what trends and priorities are being centered right now? And either of you want to jump in, please do.
You want to go ahead, Hannah?
Sure, yeah, I'll jump in. Just to first off, just to say thank you. Thank you for having us today. It's really exciting to be holding space to talk about these things, not even necessarily from a place of uh, expertise and seekers, but really all of us collectively in this together as all these things are shifting so quickly. But I'll just start with a quick intro. My name is Hannah Myers. I use she, her pronouns. Quick image description. I'm wearing a beige suede jacket. I am a white woman with brown hair and green eyes. There are large black headphones on either side of my ears. I have a silver necklace on, and I am sitting on Governor's Island, coming to you today. Um, I am the Director of Development at Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. I will probably shorten that to LMCC throughout this conversation. So I'm bringing Lower Manhattan Cultural Council is one of the arts councils collectively in New York City. We are Manhattan's Arts Council. Um, we are also one of the largest regranters in New York City, regranting approximately $1.7 million directly to working artists and small arts organizations based in Manhattan. But we also run a wide swath of artist programs, artist support programs, artist residencies, and public programming, both at the Arts Center on Governor's Island, as well as across Lower Manhattan and in New York City. But really, we are all about supporting the artistic ecosystem of working artists on the ground across our city. Um, I'm bringing a perspective of, development work. So primarily my work and conversations are focused on, uh, those priorities and relationship building with the funders. LMCC is in a unique position because we are sort of this middle bridge force in a way, right? Like I'm having conversations with these larger funders, be those foundations or government entities, citywide, statewide, federal, and then we are, the regranting entity directly dispersing those funds to artists. But then also my job is to, um, access opportunities and on behalf of LMCC and fundraise for the nonprofit at large. So that's sort of a different corner of this conversation as well. And then in addition to that, I'm also a working artist and filmmaker myself. So I bring that perspective and context to this conversation too, also being someone who is submitting at least one application on most weeks. So we'll also bring that to the room. And I think, I guess, just to sort of kick off and address your first question, Lucia, and then I'll pass it to Tracy. What are we seeing right now? I mean, I think big picture, and I know we'll get into much more detail, is just this centerpiece of affordability and what it means to be a New Yorker, what it means to be an American right now, what it means to be a New Yorker right now, and what it means to be a working New York City artist right now, and the very real, increasing and constantly changing pressures around, not only what it means to create work and contribute to the cultural life of New York City, but to live and pay your rent and pay your medical bills and potentially care for others amidst all of that. Um, is no small task. So, we're seeing the connective tissue of that conversation across, you know, the new um, uh, the new mayor's administration, and that being a priority across affordability in New York City. Um, but also in a lot of these conversations that I'm having with funders, foundations, where a lot of, these regranting opportunities are trickling down from. Um, yeah, and how we can make granting opportunities even more supportive or around that, whether that be increased grant thresholds, multi-year support, unrestricted funds. Um, yeah, so much more, but I'll start with that. Yeah.
we might need a whole session to talk about what you just said. That was really interesting, Hannah. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Tracy O'Reilly, she, her. I am the grant making manager at the Bronx Council on the Arts. I'm going to say BCA quite a bit, and that's the acronym for our Arts Council. In terms of a description, I'm a white woman with a black sweater and shoulder length brown hair with highlights. I'm sitting in the basement of our offices on 2700 East Tremont in the Bronx. Hopefully you can come visit us sometime. And I think, Hannah, you set the stage really well for this conversation because while Manhattan and the Bronx are really different, our organizations have some similarities. We are also regranters, and we're the bridge for artists here as well, between artists and funders. So we have that in common for sure. One of the things that we're seeing is, the collision of a few forces. The affordability crisis is huge. It's affecting the whole country, maybe even the whole world. And it seems to be compounded by the rapid pace of gentrification in the Bronx. Artists are feeling, kind of a double whammy in the way that, they have financial pressures, but they're also having to compete with folks who just moved here and who are not integrated into the community and the world of artists in the Bronx. So, in some cases there's some friction because of that. And of course, we're seeing the impacts of immigration. Sometimes we have events and folks are afraid to join us. So, all of those things are related and, paint a picture for us that, we need similar things as well, unrestricted funds. We do, I should say BCA does quite a few things. We do grant making, programming in terms of professional development for artists. We do events, networking events and workshops and things like that. And we also have an art gallery, which is also connected to Governor's Island. So, we have a whole host of offerings at BCA. And one of the things that we hear from people is that, they need unrestricted funds. And especially for professional artists, they need the ability to plan ahead. So if we can find ways to fund projects, or even artists in general with general operating funds on a multi-year basis, that would be welcome. We don't do that right now as such, but it's something that we're hearing quite a bit and, advocating for.
Thank you both so much for offering that overview of your positionality and more the council and within that, the greater landscape. I'm curious because you both have touched upon it, but if you could speak a little bit, to being this bridge between artists and funders, if you specify in your own grants between individual artists and teaching artists more particularly, and if so, what that looks like. And also I'm curious because it's already coming up, of course, if there is within the grant designs themselves more recognition of this kind of precarity that you're talking about as it relates to individual artists and perhaps teaching artists. So multi-year funding being an example, or less restrictions, or, just sort of how that's sort of showing up in the designs themselves.
I would say for us, it's not showing up in the design as much as it is showing up in process. Right now, we have a lot more control over our internal processes and protocols. So, for example, this year we moved up all of the grants by about 3-4 months. And the idea is that, we would kind of make the process more efficient so we could disperse the funds quicker. And, delays are not just inconvenient for some people. For some folks, it means they can pay their rent or not, so we're trying to be as flexible as we can with the things that we can control. in any way that we can at this point. So
Yeah, in terms of the first part was just about education opportunities specifically. So yeah, for through LMCC, part of our Manhattan Arts Grants program, um, which sort of falls into a few different categories. Um, One of those is creative learning. And so our creative learning stream of re-granting is specifically supports artist-led projects of any discipline that draw on arts education practices to engage older adults in in-depth arts learning and hands-on creation of artistic works. As you can see, I'm reading on our website because I am not the re-granting professional in the room, but that is one of our major re-granting programs directly for arts education across New York City. We also have our Sukasa program, which is funded directly by DCLA, which places teaching artists directly in senior centers across all of Manhattan. So there is an LMCC supported teaching artist in every district across New York City, which I believe is, or it's in 26 districts.
we have that
So
as
that's
well.
another. Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah, so those are pretty robust. And then, so what was the second part of your question, Shia?
Well, what you were just specifying between sort of supporting individual artists and teaching artists, I was very curious about. And then just in acknowledgement of this moment of precarity that you were both
Yeah.
alluding to before, have you seen any sort of response to that within the grant design themselves, or as Tracy was saying, in your own practices within what you can control and how that's being distributed?
Yeah, it's really it's interesting. I am starting to be in these conversations with, the larger funders, be they again, like citywide, Department of Cultural Affairs and DCLA, or statewide, NISCA, federal, NEA, and then Howard Gilman Foundation is our other major regranting partner. And so it's really, it's an art, not a science, in terms of, you know, prioritizing their priorities and then also designing those grant making programs around those too, while also advocating for what the artists are telling us they need. And it's quite a balance. And it's interesting, so much of what LMCC is trying to ask right now is like, what does it mean to be an arts council? Like, what does that mean? And what is the highest and best use of being an arts council separately from just being, another arts nonprofit? And part of that, the way that we define it is that, a lot of that is advocacy work, so that we're advocating directly to not only these major regranting funders and partners, but also um, the civic leadership of New York City. Like right now, we are in a process where our president is meeting with city council members across all of New York to advocate for, discretionary funds and speaker funding, um, and really do that work of communicating to the civic leadership of New York, what the impact of regranting and all of our programs across the board so that that we are the ones sort of like communicating, like threading that needle, right, across all these stakeholders, which can obviously get so complicated in the sort of channeling and bureaucracy of it all at times. But I guess to sort of hone in on your question, like I'll give an example. One of our regranting funders, as we've been sort of talking about what it might mean to redesign one of our regranting programs, um, we're focused on higher thresholds and potential, what it would mean to explore unrestricted funding to really address this affordability crisis that we're all talking about. But some of the funders are, they prioritize high quantity of grants, right? So like on average, we distribute 245 individual grant awards every annually. And so what does that mean? to if that number goes down, but the threshold of the award increases per artist or per organization, or it becomes a multi-year award, right? So those are in some ways seemingly like administrative small changes, but have like extraordinary impact. And then how do we measure that? Yeah, how do you sort of pilot these new models based on feedback, and then also, effectively measure that impact and go, well, that's better, but why? Um, yeah.
There's so many things you've brought up that I would love to highlight. I mean, one, just centering the work of the Arts Council and how that is distinct from nonprofits. So Bax, for example, and I do want to plug this because today is the deadline at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time for our Artist in Residency grant. And I'll put that link in the chat in a moment for any individual artists who are looking for such residency incubator opportunities to develop new work. But that distinction, I think, is really important of what does a council do and that advocacy piece. And it, for me, is why I centered the conversation around relationships, because I think you're speaking, Hannah, precisely to what's unique in this moment and what's unique with an arts council, but frankly, all of us, that we're seeing such a change so quickly from federal funding and the domino effect that has on foundation funding and then local government funding, um, and how then in dialogue with individual artists, we have the capacity to really explore partnerships and really understand what people need and our different spheres of influence within that to be responsive. So it's, I think, kind of frightening how quickly everything is changing. And it's also a moment of tremendous innovation and possibility, and a possibility for partnering more, which I think is also incredibly important, that we have been exposed, that we all need each other. We really need each other in this work. I would love to thank you, Kinsey, for putting that in the chat, by the way, that link. I'd love to shift a little bit towards just discussing resources and sort of finding the right fit, and how individuals on this call who are curious about, well, what are the existing resources out there, perhaps beyond these two arts councils, where they could be looking. And, there's some really big hitters, Department of Cultural Affairs and New York Foundation for the Arts, that maybe are more familiar to some people. But are there any sort of resources that come to your minds, Tracy and Hannah, that you'd want to lift up, that people should be looking at, that might typically be overlooked, or new opportunities that maybe people are less aware of because they are part of this moment of development?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of resources for sort of finding grant opportunities, period, right? There are, lots of sort of online aggregates and, like available sort of constantly updated databases that are collected. So obviously there's sort of like really wide ones that, like you said, like New York Foundation for the Arts has a pretty robust grants database. A couple of other um, uh, city um, city institutions do as well. But I think before you even get there, it's sort of like defining what you're looking for, and also knowing that like a lot of these opportunities, if we're really talking about grants, if we're talking about funding opportunities versus like residencies, et cetera, other sort of forms of artist support, then those grants will often come either as a project-based grant or a artist-based grant. And that's, I think, like a good place to start, right? And maybe you're seeking support across the board, but really starting to narrow in on, are you looking for support for production, for development, production, or presentation of a very specific project? Or are you looking to be supported as an individual artist? And of course, there's lots of crossover there, but that also kind of helps in terms of sort of um, finding those organizational buckets for what each of those are, right? Like um, in terms of project support, that's going to look different than the individual artist. And what kind of categories or eligibility filters do those things hit? Like I submitted an application personally last week for a film project that I'm working on, and it's like, okay, first time feature filmmaker, um, identifies as a female filmmaker, identifies as a queer filmmaker. Like those are sort of like identity-based eligibility things that um, for an individual artist support can also hone in on opportunities because there are organizations or funders that are committed to supporting those, specific populations. And then on the same side for project, does your project have a public engagement element to it? Is your project education based? Is there a performance element? Will it take place in Manhattan? Um, are you involving, is it intergenerational? Sort of like, and it's funny, right? Because I remember, I think when I first started submitting and writing grants, there are these words that are very funder focused. And I think you start to see them, right? Like, um, and I guess I would just say like, even if some of these opportunities might ask you to put yourself or a project in a box, there's like there is a Trojan horse sort of opportunity there, right? Like just because you identify as these things or your project checks these boxes, um, that doesn't have to define the work you're making as a creator and an artist, but it can be a tool to find funders or organizations that are aligned. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
So we offer grants for nonprofits, collectives, and individuals. And most of them are project based, but we also have one called the Bronx Recognizes Its Own Award, which is going to be announced really soon, actually, in the next few weeks. And that grant is unrestricted and it's based on basically a body of work. So, artists who are accomplished in whichever discipline can apply for that. And we award 40 of them every year. But having said that, it's still only 5,000. If we had multi-year grants that were unrestricted, that would be even better. We do notice sometimes that folks who have applied in the past and been successful in the past with project-based grants, that they sometimes become overly reliant on them. And we're trying to educate folks to look for funding in other places, because panels sometimes have a different opinion of a project, and they may want to put the funding to a project that's never been done before rather than continue to support something that's happened year over year. The confusion between a general operating grant and a project grant is real sometimes for folks. So we do our best to let people know that there are big funders. Jerome Foundation, for example. We just had one of our grantees win the David Prize, which I was super happy about. It was like the Oscars around here. But there's a lot of small grants too, and sometimes grantees, I think, are a little nervous to apply for things. So I try to encourage them to apply for everything that you're eligible for. And for bigger projects, when they come to us with their budgets, if we can see that they're having multiple revenue streams for a project, a production that might cost $50,000 to do, that really strengthens the application, and the panelists tend to view those applications more favorably. We're also doing things like having crowdfunding workshops, so artists can think about other creative ways to raise funding, and we do our best to try to connect people where we can. But yeah, sometimes if it's a big project, it requires a patchwork of funding sources, and that's the reality of it. So it's part of the whole process.
Thank you both. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of really important questions of what exactly are you looking for? Is it project specific? Is it a piece of a broader project? And from there, aligning what the opportunities are is an important place to begin. And also really thinking about, you know, being true to your project rather than we all know the kind of mission drift or the grant drift that can happen when there's this juicy opportunity and you find yourself writing something that you say, well, if this funding were to not exist in a year's time, would this project still, be sustained? Is it still of interest? And like really getting very clear about the authenticity of what you're wanting and what you're looking for and letting the rest follow.
Analysts mention that all the time. They
Yeah.
look at projects and they say, if we don't grant this, will it actually happen anyway? And it's, part of the assessment of the commitment to the project. Is our piece of the picture the make or break, or is this artist gonna find a way anyway to do it?
Right. When What would you say to folks on the call who are navigating this process, perhaps for some of the first times, and really having to think about prioritizing applications with very limited capacity? Are there any specific tips along those lines of really thinking about your capacity and what you pursue that you would recommend based on your experiences?
So in my role is a little bit different than Hannah's. So I'm the main contact for grantees and for panelists. So I'm basically facilitating the entire grant cycle from the timelines and the policies to the application process, then the evaluation, then the disbursement. And this is going to sound very rudimentary, but I'm a broken record on this topic. Please look at the eligibility guidelines first, because I can't tell you how often people spend a long time working on an application. They send it in, they get disqualified, and then they call me and they're upset about it. And all of that could have been avoided if they just looked at the guidelines. So all of our grants at BCA have the guidelines published on our website. And, basically every grant you're going to apply for has some version of eligibility rules. So that is the very first place I would start. And if you have any questions about, am I really eligible for that? Then, ask somebody before you start to work on it, because it really could be a complete waste of time. We sometimes get people from other states applying for things. And, I'm always a little astounded by that because, Bronx is in the name. So, but even those things, right? Residency requirements are really critical. Sometimes people will say, I live in the upper part of Manhattan. And I'm like, but it's still Manhattan. So check that and, make sure it fits with the mandate of the organization. So, for us, we, like I said, for the most part, fund projects. So if it's something like, you need a grant to keep the utilities going in your studio, that's not something that we do. And I might be able to redirect them somewhere else, but if you spent time working on an application and that was the substance of it, it would be a real waste of your time. So I think it starts with knowing what you want and where to get it from, and applying to those organizations that you fit with, and then building that relationship.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yes, Tracy is much more of an expert in terms of the actual grant making of it all. And it's really such extraordinary work. I have so much awe in our team that is going through the award notifications for our cycle right now. And it's a colossal amount of care and work that goes into all of it. on the other side. But this year we had some staffing transitions, so everyone at LMCC participated in reviewing some of the initial applications. Just for eligibility. So then they went to the actual panel and jury, but just for it was it was a huge staff-wide project, just having everyone review and double check eligibility, because specifically for the Arts Council's regrants, um, there's so many specific eligibility factors for these awards because of the funders that, and LMCC specifically, they're coming from both city funders, state funders, and private foundations. So that eligibility
Same for us.
bracket, yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
is like I mean, the spreadsheets are colossal, right? In terms of all of those check boxes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's, that's our responsibility to do that work. But I think it is from the applicant's perspective, right? Like, I totally agree. Spend the time using a fine-tooth comb for all opportunities that you're evaluating.
Yeah.
Really spend the time evaluating the eligibility before you take the time to build out that application.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, because and you might think, oh, it's like this one little piece is pretty close, but I can tell you there are so many people checking all of those exact requirements on the other side, and our time is so precious. So I'm a big advocate of like quality over quantity. Certainly there is an element of like it is a numbers game too, and you know, submitting to lots of opportunities is helpful, but know what's right for you and spend your time focusing on applying for what you are totally in the pocket for, not only what you are fully eligible for, but what you are also competitive for. I actually
Yes.
would say just being eligible may not be enough.
Yeah.
Just because you hit the eligibility, that's great. That's step number one. Step number two, are you competitive in
Mm-hmm.
your project or yourself, depending on what the opportunity is?
Absolutely.
Um, and I guess the last thing I would say too is like, if it is a specific project that you are, um, looking for funding and support with and applying to all these things for, take the time at the beginning to think about your strategy before you just start sort of blindly submitting to all of these things. And it's hard, right? Because these opportunities are scarce, and that's super real. So I think there's an instinct to just start submitting to everything.
Mm-hmm.
But taking that time at the beginning of a project development phase to think through, okay, I'm going to target, these specific opportunities for this reason, and then we're going to pivot to residencies in the next year because I need time with my team. And then I'm going to pivot to, this fellowship that I know I'm going to meet this person next year, but I haven't met them yet. So I'm going to hold on that one. And like really plan out your submission calendar a little bit more strategically because it'll save you time. And ultimately, what we all keep coming back to is so much of this is relationships. So, I've personally applied to things 4 times and then, gotten it on the fourth time because I finally met that person in the wild, and they were able to go, okay, yes, yes, yes. Um, and then, sorry, the last thing is just, you know, also spend that time sort of on the front end before you start blasting into applications, really solidifying your materials. Because if you have really solid materials, I know we're going to get more into this later. If you have really solid materials, then that can be translated more easily across these opportunities, right? Whereas I think what happens a lot is you just sort of start submitting and you're building your materials around those RFPs, around those applications, and they're hard to translate because they sort of didn't come from that inside out sort of core place from the very beginning, um, which can also be complicated because it's, sometimes projects end up being developed artistically or creatively because of the requests in these applications, which is also just part of it in sort of a natural way. But take the time on the front end to like lay out your personal manifesto for whatever this piece of work you're creating is, and then cross your T's and dot your I's and allow them to translate into what the application is requesting. Yeah.
I love that. And we're going to transition in a moment to relationship building, or relationships in particular. But I love the inside out piece. And of course, there's this really healthy tension between like, what is your idea? And then the dialogue that is afforded through an application process because of the questions that are asked or because of the resources that are provided, and to, enjoy that process. And then that writing is yours. And I just want to offer that you can keep that and you'll keep honing it and you can keep reimagining it for other purposes, and that there's nothing wrong with that. That is your, to use the intellectual property term, but that is yours and it can be repurposed, and it doesn't need to be inventing the wheel. And with respect to capacity, that's really important to keep in mind. I also, just before we want to move on, want to say that in addition to analyzing the labor of the application process, to really be clear about what the reporting process might be. Because if the documentation and reporting process that is required for a grant that will amount to $700, let's say, for this one piece you were thinking of, you may ultimately decide, that's just that's not worth it, actually. That, it's that whole picture is really not gonna be the value of what you need it to fulfill. And that's also okay, that it might be great for somebody else who's getting started in that way. I just last piece on this, because I did bring up Bax's residency and have been thinking about this, when we're reviewing applications, that what we're uniquely providing for the residency is an incubator space. And that comes with being part of a cohort and having mentorship. And for different phases, and it's not as simple as early or seasoned, because one could be a very seasoned artist, but be returning to questions about one's practice and really benefit from being in a cohort of collaborators. But to think about if it's an incubator residency, is that what you want versus a presenting residency, or versus something that's going to, the finances are going to be at the center. So also, what is the quality of the research that you're going to be getting as it relates, exactly as Hannah was saying, to this phase of your artistic or arts educational development piece, your program piece. But thank you both. That was really a lot to think about. And you both referenced this, but in terms of thinking about funders and thinking about the relationship with funders, and that's, I think, one type of relationship in all of this. There's also fiscal sponsors, and then there's peers and cohorts, as I just mentioned. But in terms of funders, I think there's a sort of stigma that they're the gatekeepers and I shouldn't bother them or I shouldn't ask questions. But you were saying, Tracy, if you really have a question about if you're eligible for this or if it's the right fit, maybe you should ask. So could you share, both of you, from personal experiences or on behalf of your councils, what's this sort of expectation around that kind of inquiry, and what you would recommend to folks?
So for me, being on the front lines of grant making, it is an interesting position because having a relationship with me personally as the grant making manager is great, and there are benefits to that, but I can't decide who is going to be awarded a grant unilaterally, right? And this is one of the misconceptions that people have sometimes. They think that it's up to me who's funded and who isn't, and really I'm the facilitator of that process with a host of experts in different disciplines and arts administrators who sit on our panels. So from the perspective of gatekeeping the $1 million almost that we grant every year, I can't decide, who's going to get some money. But I am really accessible to people, and the folks who take advantage of that tend to hear about opportunities more. They tend to understand things more. They get more feedback. And there are times where we need to hire somebody for an opportunity, an artist. And if I know you personally, you're gonna come to the top of my head, right? So it's not a bad thing to make yourself known and come to our events, attend our workshops, those kinds of things. The other benefit of having a relationship with the council is that you meet other artists, And we actually had an event last week where we gave people an opportunity. I think there were about 10 speakers, really short periods of time, where they could get up and talk about what they're working on, and if they were looking for collaborators or feedback on a draft or something like that. And it was great. It was all different disciplines, every demographic you can think of, all in the same room. And there were people who met each other, exchange information and all that kind of stuff, who never would have met before. So, part of our purpose is, not just to, support folks financially, but it is to advocate, as you also mentioned, Hannah, and it's to connect. One of, I think, my personal strengths is connecting people. So, from the relationship point of view, if I can't help you, but I know somebody who can, or I think they might be able to, I'm gonna make sure that connection is made. So, the relationship piece is not always as linear as, can you get my grant approved, right? In our case, it doesn't work that way. But there are other, benefits of having a relationship with the grant making manager and with the organization. And also, sometimes folks will approach me who are upset because they didn't get their grant, and they might have questions about the fairness or transparency of the process. I take great pains to explain the process to them, and a lot of the time I'll actually invite them to become a panelist, because I want people to see how it works and that we try to make it as fair as humanly possible. So that's another way that artists can have relationships with the Arts Council, especially BCA. If you sit on a panel, you then see it through different eyes. And, I've had artists say to me many times that they learned so much about how to write their own grants from evaluating others. So, there's different ways to connect with us and build those relationships.
Totally. I think it's like, I'll speak to sort of the LMCC side of it, and then I guess my own personal experience. But, similarly, of course, there are those opportunities out there where if so and so, it's going to help. I think specifically with, the Manhattan Arts grants and the Arts Council's grant making. It's such a robust administrative review process, right? So, right, we're on this panel, but unfortunately, if you know Tracy or you know me, we really can't even help in terms of relationship building and making sure that those grants are who those grants are actually awarded to. But and that's very that's by design, right? So that the review process is as equitable as possible. So that is ultimately to the artists and the applicants' advantage, big picture. Um, but who are the people, at least for the Manhattan Arts grants, making those decisions? It is the panelists and the jury members. Who are the panelists and jury members? Other artists, other arts professionals. You know them, you live among them. Maybe you've been in other panels with them this weekend, right? So there's sort of the targeted, who are the people at the specific organization, or opportunity that you're applying to, of course, and being, again, sort of strategic about cultivating those relationships over time. These things just take time. They do. We always want it to happen faster. You send one cold email and you hope that person remembers you, but building those relationships thoughtfully over time and continuing to show up so that people go, oh, she's still here. Got it. Like there's that sort of piece of it that is just trust building, right? If we're talking about relationships, period, like what's at the root of it? It's trust. And so funders want to trust that you are going to be a responsible steward of their funds, just as you as an artist want to trust that, the person supporting your work is trustworthy. So I love the way that you've been framing this, Lucia, in terms of like the funders are not, I mean, we have to acknowledge that there is a feeling of gatekeeping with funders, right? That's real. But I think what I would like to advocate for is like the funders only exist because you're making art. period. Like that, and all of the conversations around
We
how to
need each
create these
other to do
opportunities.
our job.
Yeah, we all need each other, and everyone serves, works at a different corner of that cycle. And I think speaking just from my own experience in seeking support and applying for opportunities as an artist, like it can feel so exhausting because you're often in this position of asking for help, asking for support over and over, which can be draining and energetically, right? To be in that posture always. But I think um, trying to sort of shift that positionality from being like asking and begging into share your work, um, and share it widely, not just in the moments of application submissions or these opportunities, but when you're in public spaces, um, when you're out there in the wild, in the field, in your own community, those things have ripple effects, um, which is, yeah, I think
Yeah.
ultimately, yeah.
Well, I think you've both, in saying, Tracy, that it's not a linear thing necessarily, and that you don't know what something's going to bear out later, and that reaching
Mhm.
out and getting feedback and how that can inform your process, and that it may be a not a no, but a later or not right now kind of response. And so getting that feedback is really, well, and to what you just said, Hannah, that relationships are built on trust, but they're also humanizing both ends. So the more that the grant process is humanized and lifted off the page, so too are you in communicating what your ideas are, what you're looking for, and with wonderful people like yourself, Tracy, at the helm, who could say, "Hey, we can't do it, but this other possibility or this other person you should speak to because it's been humanized," and to think about that as that opportunity. Um,
Yeah.
Along the lines, I'm so glad you brought it up, kind of like just the emotional weight of this, of putting yourself out there and maybe getting rejections and feeling very isolated as individual artists, as individual teaching artists who are often in these sort of limbo spaces of how to be defined. I wanted to make sure we talked about fiscal sponsorship as another relationship and resource in this conversation. There are many organizations and nonprofits such as BACS that can serve as fiscal sponsors for artists with whom we have a relationship, such as our artists in residence. And this is a great opportunity to work in collaboration with an organization that might know you and to support you in these processes. And so I wonder, to the two of you, or if one of you in particular, Hannah and Tracy, want to speak to this, of whether your arts councils provide that, or if you have any other specific advice vis-a-vis fiscal sponsorships that people should be aware of.
So for us, we don't provide that, but I will give advice on who to talk to. Um, we do run into issues with this sometimes because the fiscal sponsor has to be physically located in the Bronx. And a lot of times, the arts organizations in the Bronx are also being funded by NISCA. So that becomes a problem. So, sometimes we will, suggest that folks talk to other organizations outside of the arts so they can, go to a social services or environmental organization. There are other fiscal sponsors in different fields that can help. And, most of the time, they will help. Um, a lot of grantees don't really understand what fiscal sponsors do. And we realized this last year when we had quite a bit of confusion about, the tax position and who to talk to and how does the money flow and those kinds of things. So this year we're actually going to have a separate session for grantees with fiscal sponsors, and we're going to make it a requirement that they attend that meeting because we don't want any interruption in the flow of grant funding and stuff like that. Sometimes organizations are really big and the grantee doesn't necessarily know who the point person is within the organization, which makes the logistics of actually transferring the funds to the grantee really difficult. And then, taxes and 1099s and all that kind of stuff. So, fiscal sponsorship is something that we deal with, you know, every year for sure. And now that we're seeing a lot of new applicants who are trying to use fiscal sponsors, we're realizing we need to do some education around that to make it a little bit more smooth this time. So.
Yeah, well, in the name of education, I'm just gonna like quickly also define fiscal sponsor because I feel like, it's a word we use, but maybe not completely understood. So, a fiscal sponsor is basically a 501(c)(3 nonprofit entity that will sponsor either an individual artist or an individual project that allows that non-501(c)(3 entity to accept tax deductible donations, right? And so that's the purpose and of what a fiscal sponsor does. Um, there are a lot of organizations that offer that 501(c)(3 status to individual artists or projects. It's usually like an application. Sometimes it's more informal than that, depending on the organization. But it's important to know that like if you have a fiscal sponsor, your work is carrying out the mission of that nonprofit, right? That's the only way they are able to legally sponsor you as an independent artist or as the project, is that your work is carrying out the mission of that organization, which allows you to accept those tax deductible donations, which is really um, powerful because then you are able to solicit donations, from individuals as well as accept certain grants. So, and sorry, just to back up, LMCC does not act as a fiscal sponsor, um, but yeah, it's important to check, as you are seeking out support, all these opportunities applying to all of these things that are funding related and grants related. Some require you to have that fiscal sponsor, big important part of that eligibility check. But then others do not. So that's just kind of case by case, opportunity by opportunity. I will say though, if you're in a position where you need to raise funds for a project or for yourself, setting up that fiscal sponsor early is is super, super important. It puts you in a more free position to, whether that's individual donations from your own network, community, friends, family, even just small micro donations or larger gifts, you can actually accept those. A lot of people are incentivized by that tax deduction that they're able to get from supporting your project if you have that fiscal sponsor in place, which is yeah, a major activator for your own broader fundraising and support. What else did I want to say? Oh, and then just fiscal sponsorships in general often will offer additional resources beyond just that tax deductible donation status. So you should look into all of that when you're evaluating which one to go with. In addition to the administrative fee that they take, typically it's somewhere between 5 and 8% of any funds that come in. So you want to look at that. You also want to look at what other benefits and support they offer. Sometimes it's just the tax deductible status of the to be able to receive those gifts, and then sometimes they highlight your work in their marketing. Sometimes there are other professional development opportunities offered. Sometimes they'll blast your play to their email list of 45,000 people, highlighting tickets, helping with, the actual distribution of your work as well. So, all these things are things to consider. And then the last thing I'll say is uh, just because you have a fiscal sponsor does not mean that they do not take on any of the tax burden. And I think this is really important because there's often confusion around this that you were also referencing, Tracy. Even if you are accepting donations, through that fiscal sponsor, you will request disbursements of those funds that you raise, or of the grants that are brought in that funnel through the fiscal sponsor, and they will be paid out to you or to, if you have a single member LLC, whatever your tax entity is that you receive funds. But that is taxable income, right? So just really important to be aware of that. Talk to your accountants. I'm not one, but that can often be a surprise the first time that you work with a fiscal sponsor, that tax burden is there.
I know the Roundtable offers a really wonderful session. I forget at what point of the year, but I imagine before tax season, around individual artists navigating taxes and accounting and such things. And that's a good segue to, I want to move into writing tips and sort of thinking about the actual writing application. But before doing so, just to also name that beyond fiscal sponsorship, beyond, funders writ large, there are networks like the Roundtable and so many others in which you can gain so many resources and so many connections. And the importance of those peer connections, I think, Hannah, you said, it may be the artists among you that are the very panelists, reviewing these applications, and just to really recognize the incredible value of your own community of artists, of art educators, folks you went to school with perhaps, or have been in residency with, or who you work with, the value of that, of looking at who's funding other artists that you admire, and where are those resources coming from, and how that might be something that you could then look into. And also thinking, of course, about newsletters, and networks, again, such as Roundtable, that might be a resource. I wonder, before we move into the writing tips, and then I want to make sure we have time for questions, if there are any specific such resources that come to your mind, Hannah and Tracy, that you want to name now or put in the chat. Like I think of like LMDA, Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of Americas, because of my dramaturgy background. That's a great resource for online community and convenings and things like that, grant opportunity listings.
You mean for fiscal sponsors specifically?
No, I mean just in general, in terms of organizations, networks that folks might want to be aware of, where they might get ideas about funding, where they might just be part of a conversations among peers about, like-minded artistic projects or arts educators, that you want to just name if you have any specific suggestions.
Yeah, I think the ones that you named are pretty straightforward, but I'll do some thinking and maybe follow up with like more of a list. Yeah.
Cool. So writing the proposal. So we've been talking about all these things circling. Then there's the application itself, and having submitted applications, having read many applications, having sat on panels. Do you have any just tried and true recommendations for folks who, might be approaching writing their first application? I know we spoke a bit earlier about thinking about capacity and right fit, and within that, authenticity of voice and particularities around project. But yeah, really thinking about when you're writing, what you recommend folks keeping really clear, whether that's like mapping out a timeline, being very clear rather than waxing poetic, or making assumptions, or using particular insider language, things that might come to your mind.
Yeah, I'll speak sort of maybe a bit more broadly versus LMCC's, Manhattan Arts Grants particularly, because those are so specific. But I think opportunities at large, it really is this, it's such a balance. I know I was saying earlier about on the onset of a project or in a potential, strategic shift in your own career or life when you are about to start, seeking funding, fundraising, applying at a higher scale for opportunities to really think strategically and gather those materials. So, making sure that you're not building your first project budget for an application, right? That ideally you've sat down and you've thought through what your basic income and your revenue plan and your expenses broadly are going to be for anything. But then also the language that you're developing around it, right? The voice, I think like the voice of an application can be incredibly compelling. And there are, of course, some things that are um, can feel very rote or administrative in terms of responses, but wherever those opportunities are for your own voice to come through in a narrative, just remember that it's going to be a human being reading these things, right? They're going to be, getting off work or waking up early or in a coffee shop or in their home. Maybe they have a headache. Maybe they're eating, their eggs and toast in the morning, but they're just a human reading a piece of paper and you have an opportunity to speak to them. So kind of like demystifying some of that. Obviously, there are certain you know, different requirements depending on the opportunity or budget templates, and it can kind of feel overwhelming. But at the end of the day, it's about your voice coming through and reaching like one human who is reading a piece of paper. And there's something else I was going to say. Oh, so yeah, I mean, I think there's like this balance, right, between staying true to your sort of core statement or whatever that manifesto kind of is for whatever you're applying for, whether that's a project or for yourself, but then also knowing who you're speaking to, right? Like know your audience. So it is important to tailor things depending on the funder or the opportunity. And it might not just be uh, oh, this grant application is specifically interested in, a public programming element. So I'm going to highlight that, but maybe it might be one step further. Maybe you actually look at the organization that you're applying to and what their priorities are, what their mission is, who's supporting them, and go, oh, okay, um, you know, this organization is specifically uh, is specifically focused on early career artist support, even if that's not an eligibility requirement of the application. Like, how can you tailor your materials to the priorities of the person on the other side?
That's, I think that end point is very helpful framing, like keeping it authentic, but really keeping also at the center what are the priorities of the funder. Tracy, I wonder, with time in mind, because I do want to make sure the audience can um, ask their questions, if you might take on the question more the supplemental material piece of the writing process and sort of what you would want to put at the forefront as really being important when we think about documentation and work samples or even budget, just things that are also key in to the narrative of the application.
Yeah, for sure. So, I didn't mention at the top of the session that my other life is as an artist manager in the music industry. I have my own artist management company. So, I sat on a panel for NISCA, and I realized that, to your point, Hannah, about human beings looking at applications, right? I was on the other side of the table at that point as a panelist, and I did the opposite to what I tell people to do when they sit on a panel for me. I thought I could read them quicker. I thought I could get through them quicker than I did, and it was me at 2 o'clock in the morning trying to read them and stuff. So all of that to say, I think the biggest thing is to look at the grant guidelines and see what criteria you're being evaluated on, and try to write it in a way that aligns with the criteria, because it makes it so much easier for panelists to actually evaluate it against the criteria that they're instructed to use. It really helps them go through it more smoothly and see all of the things that they're looking for. Work sample documentation is extremely important. Not only the appropriateness of the work sample, so for example, if you're a dancer and you're applying for a dance production, but you send in still photos of you dancing instead of a video. You might be successful, but you'll be more successful. You're more likely to be successful if you send in a video that shows the performance. We aren't too concerned about folks using, amateur video, an iPhone video or something like that, but it needs to be clear. And, when people send in, a script or a piece of fiction or something like that, little things like making sure that the pages are numbered really helps the panelists. So, think about being very, very clear about your idea and trying to transmit that idea to people who don't know anything about you, may not even be in your discipline and have never seen your work before. But, also recognize that the panelists are reading a huge volume of applications, and you need to make it as easy as possible for them to see the value of what you're proposing and the benefits of supporting your application. So the easier you make it for them to digest that, the higher your chances that it's actually going to go forward. And if there are times that we have grants where one has scored 15 and one has scored 14.9, and the panelists are just battling it out. And the one that gets funded by that one tiny percent is the one who has a clearer work sample or a budget that makes more sense, and it doesn't invoke so many questions. So they want to see that you thought of everything. It doesn't have to be perfect, but they need to see that you're thinking about what you're proposing in a very broad way, and you're not, missing some major element in a budget or, leaving out a timeline. Another thing that I would say is to make sure that your project aligns with the timelines of the grant itself. So if it's calendar year 2026, your timeline needs to align with that, because that'll also present a problem.
Thank you. That was really so wonderfully specific, and also really, I think, anchoring in what to be considering as you go through the process. I want to just quickly echo that I think there's a lot of understanding around the fact that with COVID, a lot of opportunity for documentation was lost or was disrupted, and that affects a lot of artists and their capacity to share, really coherent or well produced work samples. And perhaps I'm naive in this, but I think in the conversations I've had, there's an understanding of that, so long as there's a lot of real clarity in the description that accompanies those work samples, of explaining precisely what we're seeing, why the quality might be what it is, and how it is pivotal to what you're applying for. How does this work sample connect to what you are applying for in terms of your project? It's an early version, or it's a mood that you are going to be recapturing, though the context of the work is wildly different, or it's a key part of the developmental aesthetic that you're engaged in. But explaining exactly what you want the reviewer to understand from the work is really, really helpful. And work samples can be incredibly powerful in lifting up the narrative.
Can I just
Yeah,
say,
please,
can I just say one more thing about budgets, just for the budgets in it all too. I think like I just, like, when I first started really, seriously applying for a lot of funding and opportunities, like personally for myself or for projects, I think there's, sometimes there's like well, budgets are this other thing, or like I'm not good at budgets, or like budgets are hard, or this is the numbers part, or like I'll just put some stuff in here, or whatever. Everybody has their relationship to numbers and math and actual budgeting, right? And I think it can also feel like this other thing, like, well, I'm the artist, but I don't have a producer, I haven't built out this budget, or it can be intimidating. But a submission budget for depending on the proposal, but for all proposals, also really tells a story. And like in the way that Tracy was saying too, like it's not just, oh, due diligence, you have a budget, check. It's like the way, a budget is just a Excel spreadsheet that represents a plan, a vision and a plan. So budgeting is such a creative process. And again, like to emphasize taking the time to make that budget, you solo or you and your team to think through those things and have those conversations before. And then once you really have all those conversations, then the budget is easier to make, right? And again, it's that sort of inside out process because a budget tells a story of who you're prioritizing, artist fees, support, all these different things. And different funders will have different priorities of where those funds are going. So there's also the way that you represent a project budget in an application of there is support already here, whether that's just a donation from your Uncle Joe or a fiscal sponsor or another fellowship that supported the project. There's already some form of support, even if it's very early, and there is still need. And you, as this funder or this opportunity, will dramatically fill that need and push this project forward. And that's such a delicate balance, right? But I think taking into account both of those, that there is support already and there's still room, there's still urgent need, and how you can paint that picture in your materials and in the budget specifically. That's all. Just
Thank you
had to
so
shout out
much
the
for
budget.
that. I think that's so
Yeah.
important. Yes, that it reflects a priority. It's a different way of storytelling about your project. And maybe we'll just close before we open to questions with this note that all of these pieces, the documentation, the work samples, the budget, the project narrative, these are all tools that go with you and that they can keep being exercises in refining what those priorities are for yourself and for the next endeavor, and hopefully that you're centering yourself and that value as you go through this. I think that's so important. I'm so grateful, Hannah and Tracy, to all of that you've shared with us, and I wonder if there's anyone on the call who has a question that they'd like to get on camera or just unmute or put in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, I see one question in the chat. What advice would you give applicants who want to apply with emerging tech projects that people may not be familiar with?
That's a really good question. I would say that you have to be really careful using jargon and going back to acronyms. You have to be very careful in how you describe it. If you think that the majority of folks would not, know about that technology, you'd need to, explain it as clearly as possible in lay terms. One of the things that I was going to mention earlier too is in a grant narrative, having too much background information is not good either, because your idea gets kind of buried. So in a case where you have an emerging technology, you might want to give some context as to what it is and maybe how you got to wanting to use that. But I wouldn't want to advise to go too deep into the background of the technology, because the panelists are going to want to see, what's your vision for your project and how are you going to execute it. And if that involves technology, you can treat that like any other, production aspects that, if you're using a material or whatever, you just explain it the same way in very lay terms. And, if you have a work sample that can demonstrate it in use, even, if it's just a short clip or something like that, it might help contextualize it too.
Without knowing anything about what kind of technology you're experimenting with, which sounds very exciting, I would just off the cuff say, look into the Doris Duke Foundation. They have very specific opportunities coming forward right now about supporting artists and technology and the intersection of the arts with technology, some of which has been AI, a cool augmented reality. Sick. Yeah. So yeah, would look into Doris Duke specifically, even if it's not, those front and center opportunities. Just clearly that is a major funder and foundation that also partners with other organizations and has been very public that that is a priority for them, right? So, and that being one example, doing some research into what other funders are specifically focused on supporting that intersection of arts and technology. It's very maybe you're like, oh, this is limiting, but it's so specific. It's actually very helpful. Like you can probably find a short list of 5 other funders that are really, you know, not just focused on the work, the creation of new work, but specifically the experimentation of technology and the arts, and that is exactly what they're focused on. So in that sense, it's a strength. And there was something else I was going to say. Oh, just that, sometimes the way that you can thread the needle with these things in an application is so important too, right? And in the technology of it all, I just very quick example. A colleague of mine just received a grant from the Sloan Foundation for a film that they're working on, which is about her relationship with her dad. And the Sloan Foundation supports science. Okay. But her pitch for that project was that it is like an exploration of psychology in a parent-child relationship. I was like, oh my gosh, genius. And this is a very specific example, right? Um, but I would have never thought, I think like first blush, it's like, oh, Sloan, science, no. But you just go one step further, and that kind of creative work of how to position a project for those funders' priorities can can strike that chord and immediately become a match. Um, so anyway, good luck with your technology. Sounds exciting.
Yeah, and thank you for those 2 wonderful examples of both a specific resource and also ways of framing things. I wonder too if you might look into any things that are happening within disability artistry, because there's a lot going on around virtual reality and audio descriptors and things that might just be interesting technology and or venues and resources to overlap with your interest. I see there's another question. I wonder, Kinsey, if we could do one last question and then wrap ourselves up. Okay. So the question is, what is your advice for ways to make money as a full-time teaching artist while you're waiting between grant periods or slow work periods? A very real question. Tracy or Hannah, do you have any immediate thoughts?
That's tough. Assuming that you mean, connected to your artistic practice, there might be some consulting opportunities. There are quite a lot of kind of micro grants floating around that might help. I might need to think about that a bit more.
Um, I mean, yeah, I'm not a teaching artist specifically, and I think this is a specific question. But I will offer that, uh, again, I'll just give an example because I think sometimes that's helpful. I was called upon to help with a film project at the Bushwick Star a few years ago, and came into the Bushwick Star and their program teaching a theater workshop at the Bushwick Senior Center to elder adults. Um, we made a short film with these elder adults in the senior center. There were teaching artists leading the program. It was awesome. Only years later, when I started working at LMCC and started learning about the city funding and DCLA initiatives, did I even understand that that was a Sukasa program. And so, like, there are so many of these sort of government funding pools and initiatives that I think are very confusing and that working artists and teaching artists are not aware of. And like the arts councils or arts organizations or larger organizations or nonprofits are like working in that space. But like the actual teaching artists that these funding initiatives are designed to support by New York City government are like there's gaps in terms of the education and awareness of what those funding pools are. So um, I would say learn about Sukasa and CASA, which are both opportunities funded by the DCLA specifically for teaching artists, whether those are opportunities in senior centers across New York City or for after school programs in the public school system of New York City. Um, and those are programs that nonprofits across New York apply for. So many different nonprofits have Sukasa or CASA programs and are actively hiring teaching artists to fulfill that programming. Um, and I think sometimes it's just like, well, where's my next teaching artist gig? But having that bigger awareness um, to sort of find what nonprofits across New York are running CASA and Sukasa programs and then do direct outreach to even pitch yourself could be a really strong strategy that, yeah, I think a lot of people are not fully aware of. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and to zoom out even more from the really important point Hannah's making, and I see that Sharon, fellow teaching artist, made this comment in the chat. And I hope the takeaway from this whole conversation is talk to fellow teaching artists and peers, be it on this call or going to the roundtable for an event. The arts office in New York City. New York City is such a unique ecosystem for teaching artists because of the robust cultural institutions that we have, the size of the public school system, and the partnerships that are afforded through that. There's so many interesting different ways and relationships to build. And so, really, to resource, I bet every person on this call has so many different specific examples and resources they could connect you to. So, getting in the room with folks, getting on these newsletters, coming to such conversations, of course, can be incredibly valuable. And so that's a wonderful place to end of like lifting up. We have resources right here among us, and how to keep staying in relationship and conversation so we can make those connections. Well, Hannah, thank you so much. And Tracy, thank you so much. And thank you to our interpreters and to everybody on the call. And Kinsey, I'm going to pass it to you for whatever's the best closing.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to uplift to I know that we kind of have touched on this already, but also just your arts councils. If you're not involved with your arts council, if you haven't checked out their website or reached out or gone to some sort of program that they have, I highly recommend doing that, both for your borough, and then there's also, a state arts council as well. So check out what they're doing. They're really great resources. And always the roundtable, of course, reach out to us if you have questions. Check out our resource library, our jobs board, all of that good stuff. It's all there for you on our website. And with that, I just want to say thank you all so much for spending your time with us, to our panelists for your expertise and insights. We really greatly appreciate you being here and sharing with us. And thanks for everyone who joined us today. And that is the end of Face to Face 2026 virtual edition. My colleagues are cheering in the back as well. Thank you for being here. And I hope that you're able to join us next week in person on Wednesday and Thursday at City College for Face to Face in person. And if I don't see you there, I hope we see you on the next thing. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
everyone.
much.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.